Welcome to the BiohackingMyIllness.com podcast. Biohacking your way to optimal health. The content of this show is for informational purposes only and is not intended to diagnose, treat, or cure any illness or medical condition. Nothing in today's discussion is meant to serve as medical advice or as information to facilitate self-treatment. As always, please discuss any potential health-related decisions with your own personal doctor. And now, your host and biohacking coach, Dr. Arthur Mariano.
Hi there, and welcome to another episode of my podcast, Biohacking My Illness podcast. In this episode, I brought Steven Fowkes. Steven is, many of you may know him. He's an organic chemistry major, blogs at the Project Wellbeing, and is the director of the Cognitive Enhancement Research Institute. He has been a health consultant for many years now, and he has been self-hacking himself for about 40 years now. He wrote many books, including The Antiviral Defense, which is my favorite. He's one of the biggest experts I know in biochemistry, nutrition, biohacking in general, and how to feel optimally well. I had to have Steven on the show. Steven is probably the father of biohacking. Some people call him the grandfather of biohacking now because of his age, but some other people refer to him as the godfather of biohacking. So I think that any description may apply as you wish. You will notice, though, that for this particular episode, my energy was very low and I didn't, ask the right questions, perhaps, or, even my wording was not optimal. I didn't express myself in a clear manner because I've been working a lot on my gut and I've been pushing my body way too much, and this resulted in extreme apathy, or I guess I was just very lethargic. I'm still very lethargic right now, but so just be aware that sometimes I just sync on a date with a guest for a specific podcast. And then if on that I'm not particularly full of energy, I still have to do it because, it would take like a very long time for us to sync and on a new date. And sometimes that's, not possible. So I hope that, with that being said, you guys take that with a pinch of salt. And, I did my best given the energy that I had and probably a little bit of brain fog as well. And let's hope that the next episodes with Steven are, not only be better, but also be at the level he deserves, because his knowledge is really, profound. And I always learn a lot from Steve. I hope that you guys like this episode. I tried to bring him in to talk about practical tools to address a more parasympathetic tone in chronic illness and how to optimize that. And there's a lot of really insightful points that Steven brought up on that matter. So I would also like to tell you that as you're seeing on the screen, I'm also releasing the analysis of the podcasts, not the transcriptions, but the analysis and the meta-analysis of the podcasts on a subscription model. So you have, the take-home points, very condensed. You have also additional notes. Sometimes my guests or myself, we refer to, specific papers or concepts or whatnot, and those are in there. You're welcome to subscribe. Until the end of this month, I have a promotion going on, a sale, so you can subscribe it essentially for half the price, and you get the podcast for the entire 22 in that format. So you get a PDF on your email every single time that there's a new podcast available. So I hope that you guys enjoy this podcast. Thank you so very much for following this project. I should also add, by the way, that sometimes people are telling me that interrupt my guests way too much, or that I follow the conversation in ways that they don't necessarily appreciate. I should say that I'm primarily doing this for myself. I intended to talk to all these people on the podcast this year in 2022. And then I thought, why not? Let's spread the word and give this to people. Additionally, it's a lot of work, a lot of work. But I'm doing this because I wanted to do it for myself as well. And it is what it is. So if I'm particularly interested in one direction in the conversation, then I'll make sure that I'll take that direction. And yeah, it is what it is. If somebody doesn't like that, there's more podcasts available, I guess. Of course, that I would like to have everyone in and subscribing to the channel and following the podcasts, but can't please everyone. That's the bottom line. And I'm certainly not doing this to cause me stress. I wanted to, I want to enjoy the process. So it is going to be like this at the end of the day. I hope you guys get a kick out of this as well. Enjoy. So for this episode, I brought Steven Fowkes, the godfather of biohacking, or the father of biohacking, depending how you see the thing. Actually, many people told me that I could not call my project, I could not have the word biohacking in the name of my project unless I had Steve with me. So this was a must. I had to bring him in. So the first session, I've already talked to Steve about this. We're going to have hopefully multiple sessions. The first one is to talk about parasympathetic dominance and parasympathetic tone and how we can optimize this in the context of chronic illness, but also for someone who just wants to get better. In this particular session, I will try to keep things revolving around chronic illness and how we can improve our parasympathetic tone. But well, Steve, thanks a lot for being here and for your availability.
You're welcome.
Especially because it's
fun.
Hopefully, yeah, hopefully. Especially because it's 8 a.m. in California, and we are very much apart time zone wise. We'll probably end up with two different audiences in this podcast. One of people who is chronically ill, like we met in mercury toxic groups, people who hang out on those groups, and then people who just want to improve their health in general. And today I would really like to stick to this subject of parasympathetic tone in the context of chronic illness, and the connection to the parasympathetic system, and I would primarily like to explore practical tools that we have to really hack this system and try to shift to a parasympathetic tone when we are primarily in a sympathetic tone due to chronic illness. So the first question is, could you briefly explain what's the latest understanding of the autonomic nervous system, which consists basically of the sympathetic nervous system and the parasympathetic systems, because there are two of them, and how pretty much one overrides the others? Can you give us a brief explanation about this?
Well, that goes quite a ways back, but yes, I mean, the evolution of nervous systems has certainly played a role in how those systems are structured and which one takes dominance or priority at any given point in time and for what reasons. So we obviously have survival value attached to sympathetic and parasympathetic tone. And sympathetic tone is obvious in terms of its survival value. Let's say you're trying to outrun a bear and climb a tree. I mean, and so your heart is beating fast, you're nervous, you're anxious, your cognitive mind shuts down. It becomes a matter of maximum energy expenditure. You produce massive quantities of carbon dioxide and you have to outgas it. And so you start breathing fast and shallow to dump as much carbon dioxide as possible, because if your carbon dioxide maxes out, you can't perform anymore and you won't outrun the bear. So this is, common to all the animals, that this is hardwired into our system. And so most people think about it as being primitive. And so the parasympathetic system is kind of the opposite of that. It's what is dominant when you're calm, you don't have an emergency. It's the system that in which healing is optimized. It's the system where your, let's say, digestion is optimized. So if you're trying to engage in physical activity, that puts you into a sympathetic mode and inhibits the parasympathetic mode, which is why, the experts will tell you, don't go swimming after you've eaten, because eating requires parasympathetic dominance, and stomach activity, acid formation, enzyme synthesis, peristaltic action and stuff like that. Whereas in an emergency, the sympathetic system shuts down all those and down regulates all those. So think about it as kind of a leaning of the body into a situation where you have important things at stake. And then there's the more modern parasympathetic system has been imposed in humans to, in a sense, override the system and give us, in a sense, maybe mental control over our responsiveness. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it makes all the sense, and that's probably why you said that most people consider the sympathetic the primitive mode and the parasympathetic non-primitive, because we have the sort of kind of provides clarity, right? We have the time to think rationally about it, and it's not just a primitive instinct of just running around or fight or flight, right?
So that's what we're talking about when you were saying, how can we learn to optimize it and improve parasympathetic tone? In a sense, we're just overriding the system with top-down parasympathetic control, where we can say, okay, this is how I'm going to breathe,
right?
And you decide to breathe that way, and you can practice it as a lifestyle by saying, okay, breathing is now becoming a part of my meditative practice. For example, for people under high stress, who may be even type A, who are automatically constitutionally sympathetic in their dominance, can then lean into the parasympathetic system or lean away from their natural tendency so that they can recover, let's say, from their native state, their default state. In the evening, when they might have dinner, they might have, emotional and behavioral interactions with their family, and also when they fall asleep, that they're in a parasympathetic state while they're sleeping.
Right. Yeah, makes sense. So what do you think are the signs that people often, should be seeing if they are in a sympathetic dominance all the time? And by the way, the description that you gave is exactly like me. Type A, I actually thrive on this adrenaline running through the problem is when I don't have the energy to cope with it, but I really, and then the parasympathetic system and the kind of meditative state sort of, it brings clarity, and it's like the adoption of I kind of decide that I want the parasympathetic system to run my day by kind of meditating all day and just deciding how to breathe. That's really interesting. But what are the signs or problems that people should be looking at to know if they are overly sympathetic, meaning they cannot turn into the parasympathetic side of it? We all know things like feeling lightheaded when standing up too fast, and even loss of libido. Those could be indications that we are not experiencing enough parasympathetic tone. But I think like factors like trying to assess people all the time too much to know whether they are safe, whether like their facial expressions and all of that, and also the lack of feeling loved or being able to love somebody. I think that when I was at my worst, I couldn't. People that I used to love, even my pet, like my cat, I couldn't feel the same kind of connection with it. And then thinking about it, it was all about not having any kind of parasympathetic dominance. So I think that this is often, these two signs, like feeling loved and not being able to love others, and losing the capacity to love others. Those to me are very common signs that the parasympathetic system is not running well. Do you agree? Can we go deeper
Yes,
on the
and
subject?
that is almost what you would call um, a human perspective on these nervous system balances that would be maybe described as being spiritual. And I think that some people can connect to it on that basis of spirituality and faith and love, gratitude, appreciation, aesthetics, maybe even music, as that kind of connection to it. But I don't know, music may be more in the middle. And but
I actually
part of
relate to that very much. I actually think that music, so when I was at my worst,
mhm,
I couldn't appreciate the beauty in music,
yeah,
right?
or nature.
Or
When
nature,
you
right?
if you look at a redwood tree 1,000 feet tall, do you get a sense of awe? And this is something that you can practice, putting
Right.
yourself in situations where you deliberately cultivate any aspect of self that is stuck or inhibited or that you miss. This is one of the things that I talk to people about who have chronic illness is, you know, because many of these illnesses and constitutional factors with development and maturation and stuff are incrementally minor, it's often the case that you don't notice it in daily life. It's kind of like having a kid grow up. If you're a parent, you see every day you're interacting with the kid and it all blends together. But you have grandparents that come and visit you once a month and they see this step function increase every time. So for them, they don't have any problem seeing these growth spurts and realizations and conceptual development and emotional development. They don't see those. You can't see those things as a parent, but your grandparents who visit once a month or once a year have no problem seeing that kind of change.
Yeah.
And so people who are ill, and even people who aren't ill but are drifting, can often not see the change that they're embedded in.
Right. Yeah. It's the same thing with trying to boil a frog, right? If the water is already very warm, the frog will jump right out. If the water is actually at the right temperature, and then we just boil it slowly, the frog will die in the water. Yeah,
We do that too with our perception of heat and cold.
exactly.
Most people who have hypometabolism and an energy rationing going on in their body, where the energy that they expend on steroids and on muscle for strength and stamina and on mental focus and antioxidant defense, all of those energies are being rationed, and they don't know it because they don't realize how cold their hands and their feet are. So, and their core body temperature, they don't notice that as well because the temperature sensors are about change in temperature rather than absolute temperature. But if you take your hand and you put it on your belly, some people wince because the temperature difference is so profound
Right.
that their hand actually is almost painful in being cold.
Yeah. And the same, so your previous point is that the same happens to our perception of being in a sympathetic dominance all the time, right? So we don't see this progressively happening, that we are losing these capacities, these different capacities, and these different things that are associated with the parasympathetic tone, right?
Right.
And
And that's where biohacking comes in. You can study things like when I was having attacks of stage fright, I started looking at things like sympathetic and parasympathetic tone and how that would affect things like breathing and blood gases. And one of the techniques that one of my associates, my colleagues, who was had studied and had used in his um, um, in a sense, metabolic predictor, is a clinical assessment, was the time that you can hold your breath. Very simple measurement. At any point, your watch goes off, ding, 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 and you just take a deep breath. How long can you hold your breath? And you can study this over the course of the day. You can study this before and after you have a change in your sympathetic or parasympathetic state, or your feelings of anxiety and nervousness and panic and a sense of doom, or a sense of alienation. You have an experience of alienation or depression, and you can correlate that issue of how long you can hold your breath with that change in your state, to where all of a sudden, instead of it being mysterious and out of control, you now see a pattern and a correlate where now you're in control because you have control over your breath hold time.
Excellent. So let's talk about the theory of the parasympathetic and the sympathetic systems, and then we go to the practical tools of it. But let's stick to the theory now for a second. What are the main factors, in your opinion, contributing for people to being stuck in a fight or flight response all the time? So we're talking about chronically sick people primarily. What are the main factors? Like, is it underlying toxicity that just, so I have this theory. So at some point I was trying to heal my gut, and I've tried all the supplements under the sun, really, and nothing was working. And I got to the bottom of things, and that's when I came across parasympathetic tone. And I said, I just realized it right there. Wait a second, I will not be able to heal my gut until I'm able to try and shift profoundly to a more parasympathetic dominance, because I'm totally sympathetic. I'm stuck in this fight or flight all the time, and the gut is simply not going to heal. But
well,
I also,
if you're a type A person, that's kind of intrinsic to you.
right.
But if somebody is parasympathetic and they're a type B personality, and now they're stuck in a sympathetic mode, for them, it's an alien experience.
Yes. But it was for me because I could shut down the sympathetic dominance back in the day when I was like super healthy. I could just, turn it on and off as I wanted, really. But I found myself in that state that I was just stuck in fight or flight, and I couldn't turn music on, because even that what used to relax me, like, certain types of music and whatnot,
it irritates you instead.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So I was totally in fight or flight. So I had this idea that I had to explore the parasympathetic dominance and do everything that I could to shift to the parasympathetic dominance so that I could heal my gut. But I also realized that because my gut was so devastated, this was hard to do. And so the question is, what are the underlying factors, in your opinion, in chronically sick people that really make it very hard for them to get out of this fight or flight mode?
Yeah, I would offer two perspectives that are diametrically opposite. One is obviously trauma. Post-traumatic stress disorder would be an example where it's a top-down kind of imposition on the imposition of sympathetic tone. And the other one would be, let's say, inflammation, which would be a bottom-up influence on the process.
And so we are going to talk about this in the practical tools, but because you brought it up right now, the trauma part, would this be addressed with a retraining of the limbic system, or, for instance,
yes.
And
that's that was my issue. My stage fright was a top-down phenomenon, and it would then manifest on that kind of basis. So for me, gaining control of a out of control process was a key to, in a sense, reprogramming that fear, trauma memory kind of a system. And I didn't have, I mean, there was some degree of hypometabolism, and has always been in my life, but that was a relatively minor thing. Learning how to breathe and having breathing control over the sympathetic influence on breathing, to breathe rapidly and shallow, to blow off carbon dioxide. Well, that's functional if you're producing massive quantities of carbon dioxide. But in my situation, I wasn't. So a panic attack is very inappropriate in terms of the breathing reflex, because it entrenches the problem rather than relieves it. And So for me, that was a big deal, was learning how to breathe properly, learning how to impose a parasympathetic tone on my body to counteract the physiological consequences of sympathetic activation. And that's worse in people with autoimmune diseases and estrogen dominance in women, estrogen dominance in older men, people with mitochondrial disorders, because every time you lower your metabolism a notch, you're decreasing your carbon dioxide production, and therefore it's easier to blow it off. And those people have a long breath hold time.
Right.
So if you're talking about holding your breath for 20 seconds, that's your maximum time. You have high CO2. If you can hold it for a minute or more, average person, then your CO2 is low, and you're more at risk for these kinds of sympathetic crises that can come along. Panic attacks, phobias, this kind of thing will impose that rapid breathing, and that will drive you into a carbon dioxide crisis. And that crisis involves shutting down your brain. Shutting down the thinking part and the strategic part of your brain that gets shut down. And so if you're going to, like me, present in front of a group of people, having your brain not being able to do strategy and memory is, it's a complete failure of performance.
Yeah, exactly. And so the question that I should raise there is, should we work on being able to have a better CO2 handling to improve the parasympathetic tone, or should we improve the parasympathetic tone to be able to have better CO2 handling?
It works both ways.
Right. So we have to work on both at the same time, right?
And you find out by trial and error which one gives you the best benefit. So you're investing your time. It's like investing your money. You can even invest your money if you want, but fundamentally, It's all based on the results that you get as to whether or not your issue with, autonomic regulation, dysregulation, is physiological or psychological in nature. And so if you have a physiological problem and you go to a therapist who's doing talk therapy with you and helping you program your thinking and your traumas, you're not going to get very good results because the bottleneck is physiological instead of psychological. But if you, like me, had a traumatic experience in front of a camera when I was young, then it's mainly psychological, and the physiological stuff will follow from psychological intervention. There's no way for somebody to necessarily know that unless you have a memory of that trauma. And sometimes we don't. We can have traumas that we don't remember.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think that this also boils down, I mean, it relates well to the other point that I was saying, the leaky gut. A leaky gut will cause more of a sympathetic tone, but a sympathetic tone will cause more of a leaky gut. So we have to work on both, and we have to find the bottleneck really for each one of us, right?
It's a feedback loop.
Yeah, it's exactly.
And so you have all kinds of parameters that can be influenced. And so, if you have a zinc deficiency when you have leaky gut and sympathetic activation, it's cycling. If you have a zinc deficiency at the same time, your problem of healing the gut will be twice as severe.
Right. Yeah.
So that's, how do you investigate that? Well, you can try, for example, doing a period of time of taking very high doses of zinc to see if that changes your experience. And that's now being used by people with COVID, post-COVID syndrome and post-vaccination syndrome. It's one of the therapies that is being developed that is being ignored by the medical profession and the public health authorities.
Right. Yeah, makes total sense. So finding the bottlenecks is really crucial in finding, like you said, experiment with different things and find out what's causing the largest bottleneck in the system. But coming back to the trauma and inflammation, so trauma could be worked on with the retraining of the limbic system. That's one way to get there. Trauma sessions with a therapist. I assume that doesn't really engage with the limbic system directly. That could also be useful, right? But for this inflammation part, so people who are mercury toxic, for instance, and that's driving their sympathetic tone, is it possible that they can do something about it before
Oh, yeah.
chelating all the mercury out?
Yes. And even just beginning the process of lowering mercury, it's a long-term process fraught with, technological problems. The human body is not designed to efficiently offload mercury.
Yeah.
It's one of those things that, back in the bad old days when we, were, less modern and we didn't have mercury mining going on in our environment. The ability to offload mercury wasn't that
Important, really,
important,
right?
exactly. But
The
when
body
we
didn't
started
learn it because it was not a
developing the
problem.
human brain, we started having all these interconnections in the brain that are based on phosphatases and kinases and microtubules and stuff like that. And as our brains became more and more convoluted and interconnected, we became more and more sensitive. Our brains became more and more sensitive to mercury, such that we had an evolution of the ApoE enzyme system. So ancient man was ApoE4, and it had almost no ability to bind mercury. ApoE3 came along, and it could bind one atom of mercury and carry it out of the brain. And so humans became more brain stable with the ApoE, and then that's now the dominant form. And then ApoE2 came along, which has ability to bind two mercury atoms, and that's the emerging form that is only recently established itself in humans.
And I think it's going to be part of the evolution in the next decades or centuries, because we are now more exposed to mercury than in the primitive times, right? So socialization is also very important for a parasympathetic tone. But for instance, I don't have, I enjoy this conversation very much. I love be talking to you, but I don't really have the need to go out there and talk to people. Unless it is an intellectual conversation that engages me in, my biggest interests like this, I don't really have, I'm being honest, I don't have the need to, say hello or grab a cup of coffee with a friend and talk about life in general. I find it a waste of time, to be honest. But I understand that this is a basic need for a lot of people. Yeah. And socialization is big when it comes to parasympathetic tone. So would you say that deep down, my body would also benefit from socialization, even though I don't have the perception that it is highly important to me?
No,
or
I wouldn't say that.
Right.
I would say that people are all over the map. There are people who are totally into themselves and their reality, and other people don't matter. There are people for whom all they need is a pair bond, that one-on-one best friend or that one-on-one pair, spouse, that's enough to feed them, and that's their interest. And then there are people who are very social, where they have a clan, in a sense, awareness. And then there are people who are kind of I don't know what you would say the right word for it, empathetic, and where they feel connected to the entire human race or the world around them, the ecosystem or stuff like that. And that's it's almost like a constitutional issue. It's a foundation of how you approach the world, and it defines what your needs are, and you should recognize what that is and satisfy those needs to be optimally healthy. And bending yourself and twisting yourself to be what you're not, putting yourself into that empathetic state when you're not empathetic, or into a isolated state when you are, that's unnatural, and it will warp you and disturb your natural balance. So that's part of the wisdom of self-discovery, is that once you figure something out, it then allows you to, in a sense, optimize yourself for the things that are important for you.
Right. Yeah, because I needed to ask you this question because even experts that I see on parasympathetic repair, they say, well, you have to go out there and socialize more because that's really important. But I don't really feel like it, you know? I feel like the need of a friend who enjoys talking about politics because I love politics. Yes, that I miss, but I don't really miss going out there and talking about life and like talking about how my day was. That to me is like a waste of time. And so we would
And
probably,
let me jump in here and
yeah,
say
sure.
that um, part of this kind of decision is knowing what's your nature and knowing what your inclinations are. And so if you have a traumatic experience of socialization when you were 1.5 or 3 years of age, something like that, that you don't remember, then it could be very useful for you to discover that glitch, rewire it, and become more social, because in that situation, your orientations towards social environment is significantly based on fear
Right.
and avoidance. And so that wouldn't be part of your nature. That would be part of your,
It's like a
your,
trauma at the end of
it's
the
a
day,
trauma. It's a
right?
trauma. And so that's hard for people to make that assessment from within their
Bubble.
existing experience,
Yeah.
where that history of bad stuff comes from and how it's operating. And before you actually remember those kinds of things, that's part of what I was talking about in terms of people not remembering what their
Yeah,
traumas are. I was
absolutely.
10 years old when I had my trauma, so I have vivid memories of it, and it's not an issue. But when I was 3 and 4 years old, I don't remember any of that.
Right. I think that that's super insightful. Thanks. I think that this is the ultimate meditation that we have to do is really to look broadly at our experiences and try to rewire some of them because some of them are simply traumas that are not, even though they probably became part of our personality and in nature, sometimes they are there because they were traumas caused by something, right? And we have to go and assess it in a very rational manner and say, well, perhaps I could change this. Perhaps I don't like my father this that much, or I don't have that joy thinking about my father because he was rigid with me, or he was really he made me feel like it made me feel like it was very strict with me. But perhaps there was a reason behind it, right? And
Well, and
that's
perhaps his reason for punishing you for something was based on his traumas as a kid.
yeah, exactly,
He
exactly.
doesn't want you to make the mistakes that he made, and therefore he hyper reacts to a situation instead of being, in a sense, the best father he could be.
Exactly. And my mentor used to say, well, our fathers only did the best they knew. And so this is really profound. If we have an issue with somebody, and sometimes we say, well, I will never forgive my father. And of course we're talking about our fathers, but it could be someone else. I will never forgive that person. And then we ask, where's that person now? Well, she's dead. It's so stupid not to forget someone who's already dead. I mean, that's we are really, I mean, the other person will not have any kind of consequence, right? But we will still hold that inside of us, and that will really not make. And but I think that at the end of the day, every person does the best they can, and we should. And that's why I was saying that's the ultimate meditation. We should assess things in a very rational way and think why did it happen, and if there's any kind of rewiring to do towards that particular experience, right?
And there are drugs that can facilitate that. um, you know 30, 40 years ago, those drugs were forbidden, like MDMA as a psychedelic. It has a tendency to um, uh, unwire those kinds of traumas in the immediacy of the drug experience. And this is now becoming not only practiced as an available technology, these kind of guided experiences, but that you can, in a sense, do with a single drug experience what it might take years to do with talk therapy. How plastic the nervous system is, and by turning off and on various neurotransmitter systems and changing the dominance and mandatory effect on sympathetic parasympathetic balance, for example, that by drastically altering that, you create an environment where that trauma is either released or can be re-experienced and reprogrammed.
Okay, so let's assume someone who's really, really sick, let's say again from mercury poisoning. The mercury in that particular case is severely affecting their ANS, autonomic nervous system. And the question that I have is, do you think that if they constantly and daily cultivate the sense of safety and gratitude to foster this quote unquote, I think it's called a vagal break, right? The vagal break to the point of potentially overriding parasympathetic tone. Do you think that this is possible? So the question is,
it's no question, it's possible. But the issue is that that's a top-down approach.
right.
Okay. And so it's very effective at dealing with top-down pathologies. So absolutely worth doing and worth trying. But if it doesn't work, chances are there's an underlying physiological problem, which is a bottom-up manifestation. And mercury poisoning would be an example of that. Mercury poisoning is a bottom-up kind of problem. And the top-down solution isn't going to resolve the mercury toxicity at all. It may mitigate it, but it's not going to resolve it.
And maybe
Same
they
thing
also
with
mitigate.
hypothyroidism, and same thing
Right.
with mitochondrial senescence. And, there's many different ways that things can be physiologically malfunctioning at that bottom up level.
And even though there's that bottom up problem like mercury, the top down approach with constant cultivation of safety and gratitude, that could also mitigate the sympathetic dominance, right?
Right. And so they feed off each other. So the idea is you can approach it from both sides, top down and bottom up, and then by experience what's working and what's going on. And I think many of the people that I've followed have found that when they make a bottom up breakthrough, that it improves the top down therapeutic efficacy.
Yeah, well, I also should add on that note that at my worst days of fatigue, the fatigue was so tough that immediately it would lead me to a realm of thinking that would instantly drive my sympathetic tone. And even, I think that the ultimate trick to jump to a parasympathetic tone is to be calm enough and sober enough to assess things and say, I decide I will impose this to my body because I know what's going on. I have this perception of what's going on, a very good perception of what's going on. I know what my problems are. And ultimately, at the end of the day, I know it's the mercury or the Lyme or the mold causing many of this. And I will not get anxious about it because it will only drive me more into the sympathetic tone. So I'll just start. That's why I called it the ultimate meditation, because to me, it's all about sober thinking and sober clarity and saying, I really want to be on this side of things and I will impose this to my body. That's the only way. But I understand it's very tough to do this. It's a very complicated exercise.
It can also be counterproductive because in a relaxed state, you may not have the attentiveness to impose a parasympathetic breathing pattern on a sympathetic body reaction, and you might forget it. In other words, I've known people when they, as they relax, they automatically give up their sympathetic, their conscious override of their the respiratory center in their brain, and that so that their initial cultivation of carbon dioxide in the face of a CO2 deficiency ends up going back to not being compensated properly, and therefore they get into trouble because the parasympathetic state on top of a sympathetic body can be a negative synergy, that somehow you have to maintain your will for a long enough period of time to abort, let's say, a panic attack.
Yeah. Yeah, I didn't think about
which
that
may
before.
be 10 minutes, for example.
Right.
Maybe it's 15 minutes, 10 minutes, 5 minutes, but it's many, many minutes. And so for that extended period of time, you need to impose a breathing pattern that would not be parasympathetically natural.
Right. Yeah. I didn't think about that. Thanks. That's very insightful. What is the connection to the HRV, heart rate variability? And so for instance, I'll give you an example. I use the Aura Ring, and I've noticed that mine, even though I'm in a sympathetic tone most of the time, in a fight or flight mode most of the time, my HRV is actually very high. It's 200, I think.
Well, that's type A personalities tend to be like that. There's a natural sympathetic dominance that is comfortable because, in a sense, your entire nervous system is wired to it, and your parasympathetic system isn't suffering because of your sympathetic dominance.
But I thought that in those cases, because it's getting, let's say it's getting a little bit uncomfortable now. It's too much fight or flight. I do thrive on that, but I think at the end of the day, this is the perception of the stress, right? That we face. Maybe stress that is good enough for us to thrive on and take advantage of it to do stuff that we like, but it may be overwhelming at times, right? And
well, totally. I mean, it's like one person's stress is another person's trauma. I mean, part of the issue of stress is whether you like it or not. And any kind of trauma that you enjoy and that you like isn't really a trauma. I mean, so it's like, is it a punishment, or is it fear, or is it excitement? There's a good example. So, if you have a coping mechanism and you thrive on the challenge of something, it's not a trauma. It's like, it's exercise, it's a thrill, it's excitement. And that's not the same thing. Even though it's sympathetic, it's not pathologically sympathetic because of your attitude towards it. So that's a top-down influence. And if you can hypnotize yourself and do auto hypnosis kinds of trainings on yourself, you can shift things from being, like out of control to being in control. And that's what I think the primary benefit of biohacking is Absolutely. That when you study your breathing and you realize I've got a carbon dioxide problem, all of a sudden an out of control element becomes in control. And if you study your psychology and realize that you had a trauma when you were 5 years old, where you had a negative interaction between your parents and a babysitter, and that you didn't remember, all of a sudden now that becomes something that's in your awareness instead of being unknown. That gives you control. And every time you bring something from out of control into in control, you're less destabilized by your autonomic glitches.
Right. But I did think that when the stress is overwhelming, so it's not a good stress, let's call it that, the HRV would be much lower. And it doesn't seem to be my case. So my HRV has been constant throughout the time, even when I switched to a fight or flight that was uncomfortable to me. Is this natural?
That tells me that your autonomic nervous system is strong, even though you're sympathetically dominant and sympathetically traumatized. That it's not because of the weakness of your autonomic nervous system. It's because of the power of your sympathetic system.
Yeah, makes all the sense. Never thought about it in that angle, from that angle. Thanks. Makes all sense.
And a lot of people with chronic illness, it's because of parasympathetic weakness and, in a sense, a malfunction of the vagus nerve.
Yeah. Well, I've tried various vagal tone enhancers, let's call it that, and it didn't work. I think that my ANS is very, very strong. It's something that it's quite of a fight that I'll have to have.
So your problem is more about down-regulating your sympathetic tendencies.
Exactly.
And other people, it's about augmenting their parasympathetic systems.
Yeah.
And it's important to understand that difference in terms of achievement, how you are going to resolve any kind of autonomic imbalance.
Right. So what about practical tools to decrease the strength of the sympathetic tone?
Well, there's the physiological ones, like, for example, augmenting serotonin and GABA as neurotransmitter systems.
Right.
So you can explore the issue of whether or not the weakness of a neurotransmitter system is caused by the neurotransmitter itself. And the precursor pathway to synthesize the neurotransmitter is that malfunctioning. So if you take choline or phosphatidylcholine or DMAE as choline precursors, and you build up your autonomic, the cholinergic system, which is the vagus nerve neurotransmitter, do you get an improvement? That can give you information that, yes, okay, there's a chemistry problem, a metabolism problem that is underlying that weakness.
Yeah, I don't think that I've ever worked too much on the cholinergic side of things. I did try lecithin for a while in high doses of lecithin, but it's not a direct colon.
That wouldn't work for you,
right?
Because you probably you're medicating a system that's already strong. But for somebody else who, let's say, has constipation, so one of the issues of hypometabolism is a constipation risk, and that is the constipation is a autonomic malfunction involving the parasympathetic system that is regulating the muscles in the entire digestive system. So you've got those smooth muscles that move food through your system would be a way in which it's strong when you're parasympathetic and weak when you're sympathetic. But if you've got a malfunction in your cholinergic system or your serotonergic system, then those muscles aren't as active and the food moves through your system slower. And so in the bowel, it gets too dehydrated and you end up with constipation. For that kind of person, trying tryptophan as a serotonin precursor or
5-HTP,
or 5-HTP, either one would be examples. Actually, 5-HTP is better.
It's better, right?
Yeah, but choline or phosphatidylcholine or DMAE for driving the cholinergic side of things, and seeing an effect on your constipation tells you that that's a weakness, a biochemical weakness.
Right.
And so this issue of top down, bottom up, what's psychological, what's physiological, when you're in a state of illness, you may not know answers to those questions at all.
Right.
But you go to a doctor, and since they don't deal with those issues, you're stuck, or they only deal with one of them. If you're going to a counselor, only talks about the psychological side of things, and you have a physiological problem underneath it, you're not going to get very good results from that investment of your time in that kind of therapy. But if you, on a self-care basis or a biohacking basis, you try these things and you see results, you take 5-HTP and all of a sudden you're not constipated anymore, then you now have evidence that that's an underlying physiological problem. So something out of control has become in control.
Right. So let's explore that a little bit more. I didn't have it on my script, but it's a great it's a great practical tool. So that people understand, we have the cholinergic system, serotonergic system, serotonin, and the GABAergic system, right?
Right.
And what else? Is there any other?
Dopaminergic system,
right,
and adrenergic system. So some of the people who have thyroid issues, thyroid inadequacies, and that's because they're cold and they've got depression and cold hands and feet, low body temperature. Some of that causes a shift of energy systems from a top-down shift from thyroid modulation to adrenal modulation. And when the adrenal cortisol system, which is lower in psychological symptoms and all, fails, then the adrenal gland kicks into adrenaline and norepinephrine and epinephrine as regulatory hormones, and that's associated with fear, anxiety, nervousness, edginess, poor sleep quality, emotional volatility, and stuff like that, which are often common symptoms of people with chronic illness.
Right. And so to explore the biochemistry weakness that we may have in each of these pathways, we would take either the dominant nutrient of that pathway or a precursor, right? So,
or you could inhibit it with a drug.
Yeah, exactly.
So
and see
you
what
can
happens.
Explore it pharmacologically. I mean, there are various herbs that can augment or inhibit different ones. So if you raise your dopaminergic tone and then you, at a different time, you lower your dopaminergic tone, how does that affect your experience and your symptoms? That tells you something about how your brain is wired to your condition.
Yeah, of course. So let's be a little bit more specific so that people have a better idea of this. So the serotonin pathway, we would try things like 5-HTP, for instance, or tryptophan, which is like a lower end of cascade nutrient. For the GABAergic, we would try GABA. I've actually tried 2 grams of GABA. So I've pretty much titrated up to 2 grams of GABA once, and you told me that that was quite of a dose already, and you didn't know. Or theanine, right? For the GABAergic. The cholinergic system, we could try lecithin, we could try, you mentioned a few others.
Phosphatidylcholine. Choline itself, or demethylated choline, which is called DMAE.
Right.
And if you're treating the gut, DMAE is not a great choice because it's specifically designed to cross the blood-brain barrier. So in terms of modifying cholinergic tone in the central nervous system, DMAE is superior. But in terms of affecting the body, in other words, where you don't care if it's going through the blood-brain barrier at all, and that's not an issue, then phosphatidylcholine, choline, or choline phosphate would be examples of things that you can use for that. And I don't like phosphatidylcholine because it's an omega-6 fat, and it's sourced from vegetables, which means you're dealing with a lot of double bonded fatty acids.
Yeah.
And so that's not good for, in my opinion, for long-term sustainability.
Right.
But in terms of biohacking, it doesn't matter.
Yeah, exactly.
You just look at it for 2 weeks and you've got an answer.
Exactly. It's a short-term thing, just so we know what is the problem, and then we can work on it for real, right? But in terms of a cholinergic dominance, I also find, I heard you saying, and at that time it matched my condition perfectly, that the muscles in our neck go extremely tense, right, when we are cholinergic dominant. And I have that.
And if they're weak, if they're like putty, then you can be cholinergically recessive.
Right. Yeah. So what is the nutrients that we can apply for the dopamine receptor pathway?
Well,
I'm not sure that pathway is the right word here, but
it is. It is.
Okay.
There's a distinguished difference between looking at it from a pathway where you're talking about production of a neurotransmitter. Right. And then there's the functionality, the dominance of that system. So the synthesis is one way to influence it, but you still might be dominant without there being a problem in the pathway, or recessive without there being a problem in the pathway. It's just one way to probe the functionality and interrelationship of all these neurotransmitter systems.
Right. And in the case of the dopamine one, what would be our options?
Well, L-DOPA as a amino acid. Right. It's a direct precursor.
And herbs, right? Herbs could be very powerful here.
Actually, foods, fava beans are 1% L-DOPA, and velvet beans are 4% L-DOPA. So you don't need to resort to a pharmaceutical or a purified amino acid. You can do it with food. And lecithin is found in foods. Choline is found in foods. Even though tryptophan is found in foods, it doesn't work because tryptophan has a transport problem in the blood-brain barrier. So if you eat turkey, your tryptophan getting into the brain actually goes down instead of up. So for tryptophan, I think the tryptophan cocktail is the best way to explore that, where you dissolve the tryptophan in pre-digested collagen protein, and then you explore, the difference between sips of that solution and gulps and chugs of, how big that dose is, and you explore it with smaller doses during the day to see how your mood and your tone might shift. And then for sleep augmentation at night, you would do a bigger dose, because you're trying to enhance the quality of your sleep, which is a huge issue with people that are not only healthy by their own judgment, but that people have chronic illness. Sleep quality is a huge input on that.
Yeah.
And so anything you can do to biohack your sleep is very important. And some kind of device like the Oura Ring or some kind of sleep monitoring system is a very important part of that.
Absolutely, absolutely. And people probably are thinking right now they want to know doses, but there's really no predefined doses. They have to try and experiment and see whether they have modifications in the systems and how they affect them and how they affect their sympathetic dominance, right?
Yeah, if you go into a meeting and you drink some tryptophan and pre-digested collagen protein and you feel like taking a nap afterwards, that's inappropriate. That's going to interfere with the quality of your participation in that meeting.
Yeah.
But if you're doing it on a Sunday where you're at home and your wife is backing you up on handling the kids and you need to take a nap because you overdosed on tryptophan, then it's no
That's
big
fine,
deal. You
right.
take a nap and you're done and you're back in, and then you can wash the dishes to pay your wife back.
Right.
So
Absolutely.
it's an exploratory thing. It's like clothing, you're going to go shopping and you want to buy some clothes. And so what do? You try them on and you look at yourself in a mirror. Well, that's what biohacking is about. You try something on and you look yourself in the mirror. And the mirror is either an Oura Ring or some kind of physiological assessment, like, for example, breath hold time that I mentioned earlier, or it's psychological, inside yourself. How is it changing your subjective experience?
Right. Absolutely. And they should not forget about the cofactors of these things, right? So B5 magnesium would also be important because sometimes they have an underlying deficiency of those. And
B6 for serotonin.
Exactly.
Yeah. B5 for cholinergic. Absolutely. So, that's part of what, the knowledge base behind this is very sophisticated. And because nutrition and metabolism isn't a mainline learning environment for MDs,
Just a totally
often
different
you have to
ballgame.
do it on your own.
Yeah.
But the fact is, this stuff about metabolic pathways and cofactors, any basic introduction biochemistry text is going to have it. So if you look at something like Harper's Biochemistry as a textbook, I think it's like 30 different editions that have happened. Well, the 30th and the 31st editions, those are relatively expensive and you might pay $100 for it. But the 29th and 27th editions, it's a bargain. You pay, $1 or $5 for it plus shipping, and it's got all that kind of detail in it. So to take magnesium with this and zinc with that and chromium for this and and B5 for the acetylcholine. You learn all those kinds of things. You can look them up in a book, or you can listen to a podcast where it's all kind of laid out, and or you have a picture. Some people learn really well with pictures, and you have tryptophan, then 5-hydroxytryptophan, and then serotonin, and next to it it'll list the cofactors. That just makes it very, very simple.
Yeah. Do you know any book that is extremely focused on this neurotransmitter problem and all the cofactors? Any good book that you could recommend?
Well, 20 years ago, it would be the Mood Cure. And it basically did that. One of the old Cognitive Enhancement Research Institute articles that I wrote on biohacking, in a sense, the central nervous system, it's all laid out in those articles. So
right.
That was 20 years ago. So, 2 years before Julia came out with her Mood Cure books. So it's not like this is secret. And I bet that there are really good resources that you can get online through YouTube or through podcasts and stuff like this. I mean, it's really ancient information. The research dates back more than half a century.
Right. So to finish off this section and also the podcast on this practical tools to get out of sympathetic tone. So we've talked about experiments with the neurotransmitters. We've touched on limbic retraining somehow when we talked about the traumas that we should address. It's not the only way to do it, but it's a very valid way to do it.
Let's talk about biofeedback, because that's one of the powerful ways.
Exactly. I would like to touch on bacteria before we leave, but that's also a very relevant point.
Yeah. So there's many ways of in a sense, retraining yourself. But biofeedback is a great way to look at that. Not only are you using biofeedback when you're doing these biohacking experiments, but there are devices that you can use, like heart rate variability that you mentioned. It's not that big a deal to plug yourself into a heart rate variability system technology and then do these different probes with tryptophan and GABA and breathing changes and breath hold time studies of yourself while you're measuring heart rate variability.
And that would be very cheap nowadays, right? Compared to
totally
back in the day.
It's cheap in terms of money now. It used to be more expensive, but the money has dropped down to the point. So, but it's not cheap in terms of your time.
Right? Yeah. No, I was really talking about the financial part of it. I mean, we just have to be grateful because we have access to tools nowadays that, back in the day were really unthinkable, like the Aura Ring, right? The fact that we can just buy a HIV monitor online and probe ourselves and see the outcome. It's just it wasn't thinkable like 20 years ago. It was really expensive, right? So So I got very interested, and I can say that in the past 12 months or so, I've been studying bacteria quite a lot, like the microbiome and the impact of different bacteria and phylum of bacteria in our biochemistry, because the way I look at it is we are beings of 23,000 genes, give or take, and
many of which aren't ours.
Exactly. No, I would say, I mean, this is actually a great way to show that, like, a grain of rice has 70,000 genes and we have 23,000. So our complexity at the end of the day has to be defined by something else. And it is the bacteria in our gut that ultimately defines.
It's not just that. We also have combinational stuff going on with our genes that aren't in other life forms. And so absolutely. The immune system, for example, its ability to interact with antigens has to do with having, let's say 10 different parts and combinations of 4 at a time involved in the antibody gives you this kind of broad-based system just by mixing and matching different units to create variability. So it's like, having a combination, is it just 1 digit where you turn it to 4 and the lock opens, or is it 4 digits where you've got, 9,999 different combinations?
Right.
That's how you can create complexity from a very, very rudimentary genetic set.
Yeah, I think that a good analogy to that is conventional computing versus quantum computing, right? We have the quantum states, and so we can generate finite possibilities, but a very large set of possibilities, even though we just have 3 states in reality. Whereas conventional computing has 2 states, 1 or 0, right? And the difference, there's an exponential growth of complexity that we may add with a quantum computer, and it's the very same thing with our genes, really. So the elasticity that they have but in terms of bacteria, I do think that they play a major role in our biochemistry. That's why I'm also kind of reluctant about FMTs, fecal matter transplants. I think it's like inheriting somebody else's personality at the end of the day, because they define so much about our beings. But this would be also a valid experiment, right? Trying different probiotics, having a 16S microbiome test, see what bacteria we lack, study those phylum of bacteria and see whether those impact specific neurotransmitter pathways in a particular manner, and then try to repopulate accordingly, right?
The problem that often you come up with in certain, let's say, technological innovations. So we've got microbiome testing now, and it's enabled by genetic screening, our abilities to study DNA. And so all of these viral tests and bacterial tests and stuff that are based on PCR testing, polymerase chain reaction testing, where they're matching up to DNA and looking at DNA fits, is that when you're studying the microbiome, you don't have access to the bulk of the microbiome.
Yeah.
You're only looking at the microbiome of the skin or, fecal matter that's coming out of the anus, after it's made this long, yards,
Path,
meters of flow. And during this flow process, you have all kinds of bacteria that are active at one point, and then further along the system, they become food for the next bug ecology that's taking place. And then further down, another transformation. So it's bacteria eat bacteria, and bacteria eating fungus, and fungus eating bacteria, and bacteriophages eating bacteria. All of this kind of ecology is very, very rich, and we're only looking at it at the bottom end.
Absolutely, it's a very limited.
It's very
tool
limited,
that we have.
Yeah. And so I think that that technology is, for most people, more confusing than it is educational.
Yeah, I understand why you say that, and I have to agree that it takes a lot of studying to make some sense out of. At the end of the day, it's a snapshot of something that is already. We take a grain of fecal matter, and we cannot convince ourselves that a grain of fecal matter under a microscope, being a PCR test, a 16S test, a shotgun test, whatever, represents our microbiome, because this is so much richer than we can even imagine, right? But I think it's a useful tool to understand whether especially when it happens consistently across different labs and across different technologies like PCR, 16S.
I would also point out that many of the people with chronic illness had their symptoms developed after a bout of antibiotic use.
Yes.
And so that points directly at the microbiome as a causal mechanism.
Yes.
You have antibiotics that disadvantage some bacteria and encourage overgrowth of other bacteria. And so if you have antibiotic therapy for one thing, and then you develop, let's say chronic fatigue syndrome, then I would move microbiome investigations to the top of my biohacking list.
Yeah.
But I wouldn't necessarily look at it from the point of view of analysis and getting tested, although that's a very powerful technology. I would look at it from the point of view of experience and how supplementing different strains of culture to reinforce certain populations in the microbiome, even though we only have maybe 10 or 20 of them available to us commercially, still that kind of study of yourself can lead to profound benefits. And we now have, it's not just that we can talk about, let's say, eating yogurt as an intervention technology for delivering a bug. So you can certainly say, okay, you take some kind of milk or milk substitute product and you add a culture to it, and as it's fermenting, you then consume it. That's one way of implanting it. But you can also implant it without the stomach getting in the way by taking a small amount of culture and mixing it into a massive quantity of body temperature water, and then chugging it down on an empty stomach when you're thirsty.
Right.
And that way, that the stomach reacts to that microbiome implant without restriction. In other words, that water just goes right through your stomach and you absorb it. Your stomach treats it as water instead of as something like yogurt, which would be treated as a food.
Exactly.
And so it's not like you're digesting the bugs as much, and you can do an implant and just, measure things like what's going on with your gut permeability, what's going on with, let's say, gas or cramping, what's going on with your sleep quality,
Yeah, right.
what's going on with your heart rate variability, any of those devices of
Heart rate,
subjective or objective testing. Do you see a ripple in any of it that indicates that the bug has had an effect on you?
Yeah, I've been actually studying that, but I didn't know. So you mentioned two critical things for that to occur, or for the body not to see that as food and process that accordingly, which is lots of water, empty stomach, but also the water being at body temperature, right? Yeah, I didn't know.
That's also, it can be slightly warmer than body temperature too, but it's to support the bacteria. So in other words, you want the bacteria to stay alive. When you dilute it and chug it,
Got it. So you don't
want to traumatize the bugs.
Exactly. So it's not a problem of the body not recognizing or recognizing that as something that it has to digest. It's more to keep the bacteria comfortable in a comfortable environment so that they don't die or they don't go haywire, right?
And then you can eat something afterwards to provide those bacteria with something to grow on.
Right.
So
Absolutely.
in that situation, if you're eating yogurt and your stomach, if you've got a good autonomic nervous system, probably 99% of the bacteria are killed before they ever make it into your gut. But if you've got, hypometabolism and leaky gut syndrome and fatigue and muscle weakness, and you're not sleeping gracefully, chances are your stomach isn't producing enough hydrochloric acid to kill everything.
Yeah, absolutely. So, Steve, thank you so very much for this conversation on parasympathetic repair and for your time and waking up so early to talk to me. Thank you so much for all of that.
You're welcome. See you next time.
Bye-bye. So this was it. I hope that you guys liked it. I also talked to Steve about, just coming over to the podcast for some more episodes. And we will certainly make that happen. We'll talk about many things like heavy metal chelation with different protocols, pH imbalance. There's a lot more like circadian rhythm and whatnot. So stay tuned. Like if you haven't subscribed yet, please do. There's a lot of very interesting podcasts lined up already. I will talk about the gut most of the time from now on, because it's really where I've been concentrating my energy. So I've got, people like Stephen Wright, an idol of mine, if you will, Kiran Krishnan from Microbiome Labs. I mean, there's many people, SIBO doctors, CIFO doctors, microbiome experts. I'm bringing the best of the best. So make sure to subscribe. If you want to get involved, there's some links below to get involved, like even recommending people for me to invite and, make your own or suggest specific questions that you may have. That's also fun. And again, please remember that I have a subscription model now for, with the summaries and the meta-analysis of each podcast done by myself. So you can check that out in the comments down below. I think it's either in the description of the video or the first comment, which I usually pin. And I definitely recommend checking that out. Also have in mind that I do this for the sake of my own joy. So perhaps if I interrupt the guest too much, or if I take the conversation in a specific direction, that's because I'm very interested in that. And, this is going to be my style. Some people may not like it. I'm still, though, trying to make the podcasts the more in a way that benefits the most people. That's the goal here. This is a journey that I'm going through. I'm getting insane knowledge. I'm pretty much in the cave, working on all these aspects of health and learning about it and do experiences with my own body. But the idea here long term is that this helps other people. And I'll be here. That's my goal now. Really, I'll be here down the road to make that happen. But I can't lie and say that I'm doing all of this to help, just to help people. Yeah, that's a very big goal that I have, but I'm doing this primarily for my own joy. So I will not let stress get in the way. I will not I'll not make this to have more stress in my life. I will not pick guests that I don't think are useful, whose knowledge I think is useful. But yeah, I hope that you still like it. This is like a very genuine podcast, basically, at the end of the day. And I hope that it helps you by hacking your health, you to a better health level, or to overcome your chronic disease, whatever it is. I'm more than, honored to be doing this for you. And I'll be extremely happy if this helps you in any way. So thank you so very much. Until the next podcast, in good health. Bye.